The first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor struck the quiet hallway of Hawthorne Music Academy, soft but deliberate, like whispers threading through the cold Boston morning air. Marcus Bennett, a young black student with an unassuming demeanor, sat alone at the Grand Steinway in Practice Room 7, his fingers dancing across the ivory keys with a fluidity that seemed almost effortless. No one passing by would have guessed the storm of talent hidden beneath his calm exterior, nor the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. For Marcus, music wasn't just a skill, it was survival. It was the language his grandmother had taught him in their cramped Atlanta apartment, where a worn upright piano stood against peeling wallpaper. "Baby," she'd whisper, her arthritic fingers guiding his small hands, "our people gave the world jazz, blues, gospel. Don't you ever forget that." She'd hum old spirituals while he practiced, connecting him to a lineage of black musicians who had transformed American music despite being shut out of concert halls like this one. Now at 21, Marcus was one of only 3 black students in Hawthorne's prestigious classical performance program. He glanced at the clock. 10 minutes until his evaluation. His palms were slightly sweaty, stomach twisted in familiar anticipation. He'd rehearsed this Chopin piece countless times, but today felt different, heavy. The keys felt wrong. Marcus frowned, pressing middle C again. There was a subtle resistance, a stiffness that hadn't been there yesterday. He ran through a quick scale. Several notes sounded slightly flat, others sharp. His fingers, which knew every millimeter of this piano's touch, suddenly felt clumsy. "Must be nerves," he muttered, though doubt gnawed at him. The practice room door opened without warning. Professor Richard Langston entered, his silver hair perfectly combed, his tweed jacket pressed. He was a towering figure in classical music circles, a Juilliard graduate who'd performed at Carnegie Hall in his youth. But to Marcus, he was something else, a wall of subtle dismissals and raised eyebrows. "Bennett," Langston said, his voice carrying that particular tone, not quite hostile, but nowhere near warm. "I see you're here early. Surprising." "Good morning, Professor. Just warming up." Langston's eyes swept over him with thinly veiled skepticism. "Yes, well, your evaluation is in." He checked his watch with theatrical precision. 8 minutes. I trust you've prepared adequately." The emphasis on adequately hung in the air like a challenge. "Yes, sir. I've been working on the Chopin for months." Langston stepped closer to the piano, running his hand along its polished edge. "Chopin. Ambitious for someone with your background. You know, classical piano requires a certain cultural fluency, a connection to the European tradition." He smiled thinly. "Not everyone has that innate understanding." There it was, coded language Marcus had learned to recognize. Your background, your people, not like us. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I understand the piece, Professor. Chopin's Ballade is about struggle and triumph. I think I know something about that." Langston's smile faltered for just a moment before recovering. "We'll see. Don't disappoint me, Bennett. I'd hate to think the diversity scholarship was wasted." He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "Oh, and the piano was just tuned this morning, so any mistakes will be entirely your own." The door clicked shut. Marcus exhaled slowly, his hands trembling, not from fear, but from anger he couldn't afford to show. He'd heard versions of this speech before. In high school, when his band teacher had suggested he try something more natural, like jazz. When the admissions interviewer had asked if he was sure he wanted classical performance. When other students assumed he was on scholarship before he'd even mentioned it. He returned to the piano, trying to shake off Langston's words. But as he began the opening arpeggio, the wrongness returned. The action felt sluggish on certain keys, too light on others. Notes that should sing were muted. Others clanged discordantly. Marcus's roommate Jamal appeared in the doorway, his dark face creased with concern. "Man, you okay? I heard Langston's voice. Sounded like his usual bullshit."
Marcus managed a weak smile. "Yeah, just the standard 'you don't belong here' speech. Jamal, a jazz studies major from Harlem, shook his head. That man really thinks Mozart invented music. He forgets Duke Ellington was composing symphonies while his ancestors were still— He stopped, seeing Marcus's frustration. What's wrong with the piano? I don't know, something's off. Keys feel wrong, sound wrong. Marcus played a chord progression. It was noticeably out of balance. Jamal leaned in, listening carefully. He had perfect pitch and an engineer's curiosity. His eyes narrowed. That's not in your head, bro. That E flat is definitely sharp, and the action on these middle keys— He pressed several, frowning. This feels deliberate, like someone messed with the regulation. What? Marcus's heart began to pound for a different reason now. I'm serious. These keys have been adjusted. The hammers, maybe the springs. This isn't natural wear. Jamal looked up, his expression darkening. Langston said the piano was just tuned? This morning, he said. Marcus. Jamal's voice dropped. I think he sabotaged it. I've heard stories about him doing this to students he wants to fail. There was a Korean girl 2 years ago. Same thing happened during her jury exam. The practice room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. Marcus's mind raced. It made horrible sense. Langston's smug confidence, his pointed comments, his certainty that Marcus would fail. I have 7 minutes, Marcus said quietly, his hands hovering over the compromised keys. 7 minutes to decide how to fight back against a system designed to break him. 7 minutes before he'd walk into that examination hall and face Langston's sabotaged piano in front of the entire faculty panel, visiting judges from the New England Conservatory and dozens of his peers. But as his fingers touched the keys again, something shifted inside him. His grandmother's voice echoed. Baby, they can't take the music from your soul. Play what's true. He thought of Scott Joplin, denied entry to classical conservatories, who revolutionized American music anyway. Of Nina Simone, rejected by Curtis Institute, who became a legend. Of every black musician who'd been told the piano wasn't theirs to master. What are you going to do? Jamal asked. Marcus's jaw set with determination. I'm going to play, and I'm going to be so good that it won't matter what he did to this piano. His fingers began to move, not fighting the instrument's flaws, but learning them, adapting to every sticky key and flat note, internalizing the sabotage so he could transcend it. The music that emerged was imperfect, but authentic, raw, honest, and undeniably his. Outside, the academy bells chimed. Time was up. Marcus stood, straightening his shirt. His hands were steady now, his mind clear. Whatever waited in that examination hall, prejudice, sabotage, doubt, he would face it the only way he knew how, with the full force of his talent, his heritage, and his unbreakable will. The game was rigged, but Marcus Bennett was about to change the rules. The examination hall felt like a cathedral. High ceilings, elegant chandeliers, and row upon row of crimson velvet seats filled with expectant faces. Marcus Bennett stood in the wings, his fingers flexing unconsciously as he watched the performer before him finish. Scattered applause echoed through the space as another student completed their jury evaluation. His heart hammered against his ribs. In 3 minutes, he'd walk onto that stage and face Professor Langston's sabotaged piano in front of the entire faculty panel, visiting judges from the New England Conservatory and dozens of his peers. The same peers who'd questioned whether he really belonged at Hawthorne. The same faculty who'd raised eyebrows when he'd chosen Chopin over something more contemporary. Jamal squeezed his shoulder from behind. Remember what your grandmother taught you. They can't take the music from your soul. Marcus nodded, his throat tight. Through the gap in the curtains, he could see Professor Langston positioned near the back, arms crossed, that familiar, smug expression barely concealed. The man expected him to fail. Had engineered—
Marcus Bennett, the announcement came. Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. He walked onto the stage, each step deliberate. The audience murmured. He was used to that now, the surprise that always registered when he approached a classical piano. A young black man in this space still felt like a disruption to some people, a challenge to their narrow idea of who belonged in European classical music. The Steinway gleamed under the stage lights. Marcus sat, adjusted the bench, and let his hands hover over the keys. He could feel it immediately, the wrongness Jamal had identified, the sluggish E-flat, the overly sensitive G above middle C, the dampened resonance in the bass register. For a split second, doubt flickered. Then he remembered Scott Joplin composing operas that theaters refused to stage. Nina Simone turned away from Curtis, who became immortal anyway. His grandmother playing that worn upright in Atlanta, humming spirituals that carried the weight of centuries. He wasn't just playing for himself, he was playing for all of them. Marcus began. The opening arpeggio emerged not as Chopin had written it, but as Marcus felt it, slightly syncopated, touched with the ghost of a jazz rhythm his grandmother had woven into his training. Where the sabotaged keys resisted, he compensated with altered fingerings, leaning into the imperfections, transforming mechanical failures into expressive choices. The melody unfolded like a story, struggle in the minor key, hope blooming in the major sections. Always that undercurrent of something deeper, the blues, the spirituals, the unspoken history of black resilience. He wasn't betraying Chopin, he was completing the composer's vision with his own lived truth. In the audience, the murmuring stopped. Students sat forward. One of the visiting judges, an elderly black woman from the Boston Symphony, had tears streaming down her face. Professor Langston's confident posture had crumbled. His face had gone pale, then flushed with something between shock and shame. Marcus could see him in his peripheral vision, watching the sabotage dissolve into irrelevance. The presto section arrived, frantic, demanding, technically brutal even on a perfect instrument. Marcus's fingers flew, dancing around the trap keys, using the sharp notes as percussion, the flat ones as unexpected color. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but his expression remained serene, almost transcendent. The final cadence crashed through the hall, not just Chopin's ending, but Marcus's declaration. The last chord rang out, suspended in perfect silence. Then the room exploded. The applause wasn't polite conservatory clapping, it was thunderous, visceral. Students leapt to their feet. The visiting judges exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even faculty members who dismissed Marcus for 2 years were standing, applauding, some looking vaguely ashamed. Marcus stood slowly, bowing, his chest heaving. As the applause continued, he looked directly at Professor Langston. Their eyes met. The professor's face showed something Marcus had never seen there before. Recognition of profound miscalculation. But Marcus wasn't interested in watching him squirm. He walked off stage to where Jamal waited, grabbing him in a fierce hug. "Bro, that was historic." The reception area outside the hall filled quickly. Suddenly, Marcus was surrounded. Dean Williams, the conservatory judges, excited students. But it was Dr. Celeste Morrison, the black judge from Boston Symphony, who reached him first. "Young man," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I've been in this field for 40 years. What you just did, adapting Chopin while honoring your heritage, that's what the future sounds like." She handed him her card. "Call me. We need to talk about your career beyond this place." Professor Langston appeared at the edge of the crowd, his presence creating an uncomfortable silence. He approached slowly, his usual authority diminished. "Marcus, I need to speak with you, privately." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he nodded. They moved to a quiet corner. Langston couldn't meet his eyes. "I owe you an apology that I'm not sure I can adequately express. What I did, the piano, it was unprofessional. More than that, it was wrong, rooted in prejudices I thought I didn't have. You sabotaged my exam because you didn't think a black student could master Chopin, Marcus said quietly, his anger controlled but present.
Yes, the admission seemed to cost Langston something. I convinced myself I was testing your adaptability, but that's a lie. I wanted you to fail because you challenged my assumptions about who belongs in classical music. He finally met Marcus's gaze. I was wrong. Profoundly, inexcusably wrong. Your apology doesn't fix what you did, Marcus said. And it doesn't fix whatever you've done to other students who didn't survive your tests. Langston flinched. You're right. I'll be reporting my actions to Dean Williams. There should be consequences. Marcus studied him for a long moment. There should be. But more than that, this whole institution needs to reckon with why students like me are still rare, why we're still questioned, still tested differently, still expected to prove ourselves twice as hard. I understand, Langston said softly. And for what it's worth, you've taught me more in one performance than I've learned in 30 years of teaching. Marcus nodded slowly, then turned back to the celebration waiting for him. 2 weeks later, Marcus stood before the full faculty assembly, invited to speak about diversity in classical music education. Dean Williams had launched a formal investigation into discriminatory practices. Professor Langston had been placed on administrative leave. And Marcus had been offered a full scholarship to continue his graduate studies, not as a diversity admit, but as one of the most promising talents in the program's history. But what mattered most to Marcus was the email he'd received that morning from a 15-year-old black girl in Chicago. I saw a video of your performance. I thought classical piano wasn't for people who look like us. You changed my mind. I'm going to audition. Marcus stood at his grandmother's worn upright piano in his apartment, the one he'd had shipped from Atlanta. He played a few bars of Chopin, then let his fingers drift into a blues progression, smiling as the two traditions merged under his hands. The music had always been his. The Academy was only beginning to understand that it belonged to everyone brave enough to claim it. His phone buzzed. Dr. Morrison, confirming their meeting about the summer program she was launching, designed to bring more young musicians of color into classical spaces, to ensure that what Marcus had endured wouldn't be the last chapter, but the beginning of a new story. He replied with one word: yes. Outside, Boston's autumn sun set over the conservatory district, casting long shadows that were finally, slowly, beginning to shift. Marcus Bennett had played more than a piano exam that day. He'd played a revolution. One note, one truth, one undeniable performance at a time. The symphony of change had begun, and this time, everyone would hear it. अभी तुम्हारे सामने मैं 30 detailed cinematic prompts post कर रहा हूँ, based on your story.